So I'm going to start with what really is the ancient method of water gilding. And it's really based on three materials. And that is glue here, it's chalk, and it's clay. So those are the three components that you need. As you can tell, pretty low-tech stuff, but perfect. I mean, in a way that it doesn't get any better. And there have been other methods of gilding that have arrived, which I will also show you, but nothing has ever achieved the kind of results that come from water gilding. So what I do is I make glue, and of course this turns into a paste, and I mix that with chalk. So it's a gluey chalk that I come up with, and then I paint that gluey chalk in about 10 layers onto this, I don't know which camera is on at any given time, onto a piece of molding like this. When I do that, it becomes very gloppy and thick. It's a lot of body to this material. It's called gesso. Some people know gesso as a painting medium. This is different from that. The painting medium is very toothy and accepts paint really well. What I'm after is a completely smooth surface in a way that you can imagine if you were to sand chalk, that it would get completely smooth without any features at all. That's what I'm after with this. So when I paint it on, it's very gloppy, and then I take sandpaper, very fine sandpaper, and I sand this. And this is the place where I spend the most time in any framing project, is sanding. I sand, and then I sand, and then I do something, and then I sand it again, and then I do something else, and then I sand it again. It's very important that whatever we're gilding is perfectly smooth. And that's because when you lay a layer of gold on something, it accentuates any imperfection at all. If you lay gold on something, it doesn't hide anything. It makes it bright. So it has to be perfect. So the process is to gesso this up so that I eliminate any evidence of wood grain or knots or this seam that's in the corner. That's my ambition. I want this to be perfectly smooth after I sand it. And then once I sand it, I take clay, and this comes in a couple of colors. I'll use the red because that's the most common used. But I mix that also with glue. And that's a heating process, and it turns into kind of a paint-like substance. And then I brush that onto the top of the chalk. And I brush about 4 or 5 layers of that on. I want a good thick layer, although the clay doesn't have a lot of body to it. I need a good thick layer so that I can sand it as well, and I don't want to sand it away. So once I put the clay on, it builds up, and then I sand it with a very light sandpaper to remove all brush strokes. And then I take a piece of steel wool, and I rub it very hard. I rub this very hard. And that's called pre-burnishing, and that will eliminate any porousness that the clay has. And if you can imagine clay like a wet clay, if it does not have any pores in it, it turns into a very deep, rich color. And it also becomes perfectly smooth, so that then when I put water on it, that's where the water comes in. When I put water on it, it activates the glue in the clay again, and then I can lay a leaf on it. So I'm going to show you that. This is a piece that I've prepared, and pardon, I've dropped a little chalk on this on the way in. It's very windy, isn't it? So I'm going to steel wool this a little bit so that it becomes a little bit burnished. It takes all the pores out of the clay. Then I have a book of gold. I don't know if you can see this very well. And in the upper camera, you can kind of see a little bit how wispy it is. I'm trying to get it to flop around a little. It always flops when you don't want it to. But anyway, so you kind of see how it's falling forward there. Can you kind of see that? How it's very wispy. Okay. I should do this a better way. I should just decide to pick this up. And then I can show it to you for real. You can see that there's nothing to it. This is made by beating it with a hammer, and there's mechanisms to do that these days. But in the old days, they used to actually take a hammer and beat gold until it was very thin as they could get it. Of course, with machines, they can get it a lot thinner than they used to. This gold is tremendously thin. And I did the math on this one day, and I discovered that it takes 200 sheets of this to make up the thickness of a piece of paper. So you can't handle it with your hands, or at least you can't really manipulate it with your hands anyway. But you always work with the book, and you're always working with this thing called a gilder's tip. And this is made out of squirrel hair, and that's just the length of the hair is desirable for actually picking up the gold. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut the piece of gold, I'm going to pick it up with the gilder's tip, and then I'm going to lay it on here. But there's a process to that, so I'm going to get going. One thing I need is static, because that's what picks it up. That's what picks up the gold. And the way I do that is I grease myself up a little bit. So I take a little Vaseline, and I rub it on my arm here. And then this is the water, which is more than just water. It's called Gilder's liquor. And there's some jokes about that, but I'm not sure they're entirely true, so I don't want to lead you down any paths. But what I do is I brush this on. This is made up of about 2/3 water and about 1/3 regular rubbing alcohol. And the alcohol is there to help it evaporate. And then there's a tiny bit of glue in there. So I'm going to brush this on to my little stick here. And I brush it on there first. It starts to activate that glue there. But it's also going to dry very quickly, so I'm going to have to do that again. Then I get myself a piece of gold exposed. Get the next one. So I got a nice clean piece of gold. I get my gilder's knife, because I want to cut this. I don't want to pick up the whole leaf. I'm going to cut this like so. And then I need to build up some static on this brush. So I rub my arm, and then I lay this on here, and I pick it up. So at this point, I've got it on my tip, and I'm ready to lay it down. I hope this is visible on where we're looking. And then I have to brush this again, because I have to make sure I have a lot of water on here. The more water, the better. and then I lay it down. And if this is good clay, you'll see the gold just jump off of the, it'll jump off of the tip. It was, so that was pretty good. And I will lay another. The reason that didn't jump off the way I wanted it to, I mean, it did well, but it didn't have enough water on it. So I'm going to do that again, and I'm going to put some more water on it. You see how it sucks down onto that. I'm going to go ahead and just gild the rest of this. Is this in a position where you can see? I hope you can. So just give me a few more passes at this. Sometimes it starts to, you gotta breathe, make the wind get it where you want to, and then you lay it down. As I'm doing this, because there's so much water on here, there can be bubbles under there. There can be air bubbles. There can be a layer of water bubbles. And so it's really important that I take a dry cotton ball and just tamp it down. Once this gets wet, it's no good. So I have to set it aside and let it dry for itself. That's why I always have at least 2 or 3 cotton balls on my table. I got to do this, getting ahead of myself. It's very fragile at this stage. When the clay dries, when the glue dries, then it will be very secure on there, and it will allow me to burnish. If your tip has too much gold flakes on it, it loses its static. So the way I deal with that is I stick it under my arm. So sometimes I get to go home and I have gold under my arm. It's very sexy. So there I go again, and I need to soup this up a little bit again. And I lay it. And I got one more to do then. Okay, so that's that. And down. Okay, that's a huge relief. Sometimes gold doesn't behave like you want it to. And if it's an extra dry room, or if there is any air movement at all, I almost called Stan and asked him to turn the fans off. If there's any air movement at all, it can make your gold float away. And if it's too dry in the room, or there's too much static, then the gold will jump at your gilder's tip, which is very unnerving, because then it wads up and it's totally useless after that. So I will take a dry piece of cotton ball and then tamp this down nicely, and then we will let this go